Trump seems to be making the leap that this memo, which is quite narrowly focused, vindicates him in the entire Russia investigation, which it doesn't, because what the memo is looking at is very specifically the way that the FBI and DOJ went about obtaining a surveillance warrant against one of Trump's campaign members, Carter Page. And what the memo alleges is that the DOJ and the FBI relied very heavily on the so-called Steele dossier, which was a very political document funded by the Democrats. And so the memo alleges that because it was such a political document and the judge wasn't informed about that funding, that sort of taints that entire process. Trump is making the leap that therefore vindicates him for everything, but that's troubling for a couple of reasons. The first being that a number of the allegations and assertions made in the memo are now are a bit troublesome, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The second is the messaging, and this is where we separate Trump from the other Republicans. Earlier this week, Paul Ryan, in trying to justify the memo being released, basically said that this memo isn't an indictment of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, the FBI, or the special counsel. This is looking specifically at oversight for one very specific process. It's not looking at the bigger picture, but it appears Paul Ryan and Donald Trump aren't on the same page because, as we see from that tweet, it appears Donald Trump thinks that it is an indictment of the entire system.
Well, that said, we do know that the Democrats and the FBI don't agree with the analysis here. What's their take on all of this?
That's right, even some Republicans as well. The FBI saying that this memo is leaving out some very specific facts, so it doesn't tell the whole story. Democrats are saying it cherry-picks some of the facts, and essentially it's a very thinly veiled attempt by Republicans to muddy the waters around the special counsel investigation. And the problem, and as I alluded to earlier, is that a lot of the assertions made in the memo, the longer we see them, the longer we get a chance to analyze them, and the more information comes out, they're starting to see some cracks in them. Specifically, one of the key allegations that the judges weren't informed about the political nature of the Steele dossier when handing out this warrant for Carter Page. Well, there are now reports saying that, in fact, the FBI and Department of Justice did tell the 4 Republican judges that this was a political document, although reports say they didn't mention that it was paid for by the Democrats. And the dossier also undercuts another key argument Republicans have made, that the dossier is what sparked the entire Russia investigation. The memo itself says that it was George Papadopoulos, another Trump campaign member, that sparked the investigation back in the summer of 2016. But the glaring weaknesses in the memo aside, the fear amongst many in Washington is what Trump is going to do with the information. Is he going to use it as a pretext to fire the special counsel, Robert Mueller, or the Deputy Attorney General, the man Mueller reports to, Rod Rosenstein? So far, Trump was vague about that yesterday, but his press people were in the media yesterday and this morning saying that Trump still has confidence in Rosenstein, so don't expect any sort of Nixonian Saturday night massacre. But remains to be seen what Trump is going to do, and based on his tweets, at least it seems for now that he thinks he's vindicated.
And our thanks to Steve D'Souza in New York. Well, we can also tell you that the Democratic House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi is also weighing in on this memo. She blasted Donald Trump and House Republicans for their decision to release the memo, saying it could ultimately cause a constitutional crisis.
With the memo that the president approved the release of, he has abdicated his responsibilities as commander-in-chief to protect the American people by protecting our intelligence sources and the rest. It's appalling. It's a misrepresentation. It isn't even the release of intelligence material. It's a release of a distortion of it. What is its purpose? Its purpose is, of course, to thwart the investigation, the Mueller investigation.
You want to know the truth? I think it's a disgrace.
And Donald Trump repeated that comment on Twitter today, keeping alive the latest controversy over the probe into Russian meddling of the 2016 U.S. election. He is calling the investigation a witch hunt. The newly released Nunes memo shedding doubt on whether the FBI acted impartially. It also paints Trump as the victim of a smear campaign.
There's been no collusion. There's been no crime.
There's no collusion whatsoever.
And there is no collusion.
The memo suggests the U.S. Department of Justice knowingly relied on evidence gathered by Trump's political enemies to spy on the Trump campaign. The evidence we're talking about is the Steele dossier, and it claimed, among other things, that the Russians had compromising information on Donald Trump. The report was put together by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, and it was partially funded by the Democrats. Trump says it is dirty politics.
They've had this phony cloud over this administration, over our government, and it has hurt our government. It does hurt our government. It's a Democrat hoax.
The White House and Republicans are trying to shift the focus off the Oval Office by undermining the FBI and repeatedly criticizing the Bureau.
Hillary Clinton had an interview where she wasn't sworn in. She wasn't given the oath. They didn't take notes. They didn't record. And it was done on the 4th of July weekend. That's perhaps ridiculous, and a lot of people looked upon that as being a very serious breach.
So is Trump winning at spin? In 2014, a Gallup poll suggested 62% of Republicans thought the FBI was doing an excellent or good job. In a new Gallup poll, that number among Republicans has dipped to 49%. The FBI wanted the memo to be kept secret, saying, quote, "We have grave concerns about material omissions, a fact that fundamentally impact the memo's accuracy." Well, let's pick up this conversation right now and go to the U.S. Capitol. Jeremy Mayer is with George Mason University. He is also the author of this book, American Media Politics in Transition. So, Jeremy, nice to have you on the program. I want to begin with Donald Trump. How could the U.S. president benefit from the release of this memo?
Well, it gives his messaging amplification. It's quite an achievement of spin, actually, because if this congressman had held a press conference and said Donald Trump's paranoid fantasies are right, very little coverage. But to have his staff write down a memo using classified information that's 4 pages long that says essentially the same thing, we're getting worldwide coverage of this, and it may well provide Trump's justification for firing the Assistant Attorney General.
Well, let's talk about that. And as we lead into that, I do want to go back a little bit because, we have heard that we have heard time and time again this past year, Trump and other Republicans criticizing the DOJ, the Department of Justice, essentially attempting to shift the focus away from the Oval Office. Take a look at this tweet. It's from the U.S. president earlier this year, in which he wrote the following, quote, "Crooked Hillary Clinton's top aide, Huma Abedin, has been accused of disregarding basic security protocols. She put classified passwords into the hands of foreign agents. Remember sailors' pictures on submarine? Jail. Deep State Justice Department must finally act also on Comey and others." So what effect is this type of attack having on the Department of Justice and the trust which Americans can have on bureaucrats and agents like those at the FBI who are working for the overall security of Americans?
Well, it's very troubling, and it's similar to what you see in democracies that are undergoing authoritarian problems. So it reminds me of Erdogan in Turkey and his attack on the institutions of Turkish democracy. What Trump is doing is a very dangerous game. He's saying, if you investigate me, I will destroy the investigators, and that is the Department of Justice and the FBI. And we have, for a long time, trusted in the independence and the integrity of those institutions. And sometimes they have done wrong things in the past. Trump is not wrong to be skeptical, but there's very little evidence for anything that he's claiming. For example, the memo says the surveillance warrant on Carter Page was unjustified. Well, there's a lot of reasons apart from the dossier to believe that the FBI was just in wanting to surveil this man.
Well, and you also mentioned that this memo could be used to fire people in the DOJ, namely Rod Rosenstein, as well as perhaps even Robert Mueller, who's leading the Russia investigation. Are we there, though? Yes, they have released this memo. Yes, it creates some political spin in favor of Donald Trump and Republicans who support him. But that's a fairly dangerous game to play, isn't it, for a U.S. president?
Well, the memo may be important for what it says about its author and people like him in Congress. Because if they're willing to swallow these horribly incomplete, fake allegations, then when Trump does fire Mueller or fire Rosenstein, it seems like the vast majority of House and Senate Republicans are going to be reluctantly okay with that. And many of them are going to be enthusiastic for it.
And to that point, we did hear from Nancy Pelosi earlier in the program a comment in which she said the release of this memo could lead to a constitutional crisis in the United States. Again, the DOJ, the FBI, many Democrats were worried about the release of this memo, saying that it could harm national security, national secrets, and now a constitutional crisis. Do you see that forming right now?
I don't see a threat to national security in the memo's contents. It's just about one reason for a FISA warrant. Now, FISA warrants are deeply secret, but this memo doesn't hurt the process, except it hurts Americans' perceptions of the fairness of that process. I don't think this was an unfair warrant. I do think there are reasons to look at the FISA process. Maybe we should make some fixes, but there's nothing here that seems to be deeply troubling.
Nothing deeply troubling, but as you say, it seems that this is all political spin.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really high-quality bullshit. I mean, the fact that they've turned this nothing burger into an international news story is a true tribute to their ability to spin to their base. I'm wondering if it's working beyond their base. I don't think it is.